Alright, welcome back to this series on interest and depreciation. Now we've got a new topic which is going to be simple interest. So let's first start off with discussing what is interest. So interest is a fee that a borrower has to pay to a lender in order to convince the lender to let them lend out their money, to make it worth their while. So a good example of this is something like a bank, which you probably are most familiar with the term of interest. So let's just say that this is a bank here. And if you wanted to buy something like a house, then you would need to borrow from the bank, who would be your lender. So the bank would then charge you interest on top of the money that you borrow from them in order to make it worth their while to lend that money out in the first place. But if you just put your money in the bank, then you become the lender to the bank, who becomes the borrower, because they want to borrow your money off you so they can lend it to those other people that want to buy houses. So to make it worth your while putting your money in the bank, because you're the lender, the bank will then pay you interest in your bank account because you're letting them take your money to lend out to other people. So you get paid interest if you have your money in the bank, but you will need to pay interest or become a borrower from the bank if you want to take a loan. Another thing to realize is that sometimes the cost of borrowing money is very, very expensive, and other times it can be quite cheap. The thing that determines whether it's expensive to borrow or whether it's cheap to borrow is something called the interest rates. Now, these interest rates are usually given in percent terms, usually in per annum terms, or PA, remember annum meaning year in Latin, so per year. And these rates are usually controlled by the central banks, like the Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve, to encourage spending with cheap borrowing or to discourage spending with expensive borrowing, depending on the economic circumstances. Now, there's different types of interest. So today, the interest we're going to learn is going to be simple interest. So the other type of interest, which we'll learn in the next lesson, is going to be called compound interest. And the difference is, with simple interest, let's just say you put down something called a principal, your initial amount, you're only going to get paid interest on this initial amount, not any extra money that might come while you've lent that money out. So it's just on the original money. So it's usually paid just once when the borrower's finished and they want to give the money they borrowed back to the lender, plus a little bit of extra interest. So simple interest is usually given with a nice simple formula as well, which is going to be I equals P, P, R, N. And what this stands for is interest is equal to the principal, which is the initial amount of money, times the rate, because remember when things are sandwiched together, it means times. And again, these interest rates are usually expressed in percent per annum, so per year. They can be expressed in other ways, but this is the normal way that you would express it. And then this N is the number of time periods. So usually your N has to match with your rate. So if I decided to give my rate in per annum, then I'm counting the number of annums or years. So remember, per annum means years. So your number would then be in years as well. But if I decided to give my interest rate in months for some strange reason, then my number would then need to be months if I change my rate. So your number of time periods and your interest rate will generally need to be in the same time format. Okay, so to give an example, just so that we understand how this concept works, let's just say that Mark here in the red has a business idea, but he doesn't have enough money to make it happen. So what has he got to do? He's got to take out a loan and become a lender and become a borrower from John, who is willing to lend him the money. So Mark wants $10,000 to get his business started off the ground. But after explaining his idea to John, John is not sure whether it's going to be worth his while because he doesn't think it's going to work. So to make it worth his while, John says that he'll loan Mark the money if he's given an interest rate of 10% per annum, so per year. So Mark says that he's going to need this money for 5 years. So the question is here that I'm going to ask, how much money in interest is John going to get for lending this $10,000 to Mark for his business at 10% per annum for 5 years. And remember, because we're using simple interest, that means that we're only going to be calculating interest based on the principal amount, not on anything extra on top. So remembering our formula, we've got I equals PRN. So what we're going to have to do to find our I is we're going to need to substitute this PRN. So our principal in this case, our initial amount is going to be $10,000. Our rate is going to be 10% per annum. And our N, our number of time periods, is 5 because we have 5 years. Now we've got to check that these two match up. Now this is 10% per annum, so per year, and this is 5 years. So they're both in years and we should be good to go. So all we need to do to calculate the total amount of interest, so the extra money that John will get back on top of his $10,000, is going to be the product of these four here. So remember, when we're calculating this, percent means out of 100 or times 1 on 100 if you like. Okay, so it can mean either of those things. So if you do that, 10 on 100 or 10 times 1 on 100, then what we get is we get 0.1. 10,000 times 0.1 times 5. And if you put that into your calculator, our total amount of interest is going to be $5,000. So this $5,000 is what John's going to get paid on top of his $10,000 that he initially lent. So 5 years later, when Mark's finally finished with his business and can give the money back, he's going to pay him a total of $15,000 back, which is going to be made up of the initial money that he borrowed, the principal, $10,000, plus the interest, which is going to be $5,000.